So Josh and I, we actually met at school at BYU, Idaho. We were in a business class together. And Josh actually had a business selling ties. He was the $8 tie guy. And I sold ties for him in front of the grocery store in Rexburg, Idaho for a couple hours one day. But yeah, and then so I run the meetup group for FreeCodeCamp here in Salt Lake City, and he showed up to a meetup group once, and here we are today. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about Flexbox and Grid. Oh, sorry. So as web developers, we often get caught up learning the latest technology or framework in JavaScript, right? And sometimes we neglect to learn new things in regards to markup, layout, and styling. So we wanted to kind of touch on those topics today and talk about Flexbox and Grid and how you can use those to style your pages with style. So let's talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today. In the early stages of web development, there weren't that many tools available to style your page. At first, the only real styling could be done within your HTML markup. Right, so it resulted in some ugly web pages, kind of like this, right? So then people started using tables to style their pages, and this wasn't really semantic, and it's not really easy to make it flexible, and so this was really hard on the design and was really difficult to work with. As CSS came along, but because good old Microsoft and Internet Explorer did not really support it, people did not use it. So people started using floats. And floats, you can achieve a pretty decent layout using floats. They originally were created to wrap your text around images. But again, it's really difficult, it takes a lot of code to make this a flexible layout, right? So let's talk about kind of some tools like Flexbox that we can use to make this a little bit easier and a little more flexible. So with Flexbox, you have your Flex container, which is the parent item, and then you have your Flex items, or the children. Any parent element can be set as a Flex container. You just add a simple display flex or display inline flex on it to make it into that parent Flex container. So let's look at the other properties on this. First, you have your Flex direction, and that dictates which direction your content is going to flow, either in a row or a column. Flex direction also sets up your two axes for your Flex container. You have your main axis and your cross axis. Flex direction row sets up the main axis going from left to right, cross axis going from top to bottom. If you do flex direction column, it'll set it from, the main will be top to bottom, and the cross will be left to right, right? So just kind of flips those. Next you have flex wrap. So with flex wrap, its default is no wrap. So the more items you can keep adding as many items as you want, and the container is going to try and fit those in there and display that the best that it can. If you set it to wrap, then it will then wrap onto the next line. So you want to set it to wrap. If you don't set it to wrap, you might have some horizontal scrolling and some bad UI experience right there. You can also do wrap reverse, which just, as it implies, reverses it. We'll wrap it onto the previous line. So if it's on the column, it will wrap it onto the line previous, right? Then we have flex flow. And so I want to talk about this before we move on. Flex flow is just a simple shorthand you can do. You do flex flow, set up the direction, and then set up your wrap values on there. So justify content, right? So all of these properties rely on these axes, right? These properties set up exactly how your content will, they're based off of these axes and how they will align themselves along those axes. So justify content defines how items are laid out along the main axis. It defaults to flex start, which will, so if you have flex direction row, we'll put everything on the left, right? Flex end obviously puts it down to the end. Center puts it in the middle. Space between, so space between, your Flexbox will calculate the available space in the container and will allocate that space between every single item. You also have space around, which is very similar, but we'll put equal space on every side, on both sides of those items. Then we have align items. This is very similar to justify content. Okay, so this is very similar to justify content, except that it lays out items along the cross-axis, right? Again, we have flex start, flex end, center, and then this one has stretch, which will just stretch it along the cross-axis, and then we'll have baseline. This looks really similar to flex start, but below here I've got on this image, see there's a little bit of space above the first item. Baseline will align the content to the first line of text on that item, right? Or the bottom of that item. And so the first item moves down because the font is bigger on those other two items, and so it brings it a little bit down. So depending on your use and your needs, you can use that. We have also align content. Align content is basically the same thing as align items, except that it affects multi-line containers. So if you have set the wrap property to wrap, and it becomes a multi-line container, then align content will then take over and be the one aligning that. And it's a little bit different than align items, and I will show, if we have a little bit of time and the internet comes back, I will show you guys some examples of that. So let's talk a little bit then about flex item properties. First, you have order. If you guys have worked with Z-index, you guys will understand how this works. It will just affect the order that these items are displayed in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, I've got these laid out. If I change the order of item 1 to 1, it will then move to the end. The default for the order property is 0, and you can adjust it from there. You can go negative values and positive values. So here's a little bit of example or of a use case, right? So I work for a sign company on their website, and so one of the signs we sell are these real estate signs. So I've got this flex container with the text on one side and the image on another. Once we get down to smaller screen sizes, I don't want that text so crammed in there with the image, so I can just change the order of that image to -1, and it will pop in front of all the rest of the content, right? So it's really simple media query, just at its whatever breakpoint you want it, you set that order and it flips. Okay, so Flexbox, inherent in its name is that it's going to be flexible, right? The flex grow and flex shrink properties are what give Flexbox its flexibility. These properties control how the item is going to react to the space available within the container. And you can use any number from 0 to any positive number, right? So flex grow defaults to 0, meaning that it will not flex and will not grow to fill the available space. If you set it to 1, it will fill all the available space, right? So flex shrink does the exact opposite, except its default is 1 and will automatically shrink. So as the page resizes, this content will resize to fit its container. Then we have flex basis. So flex basis is the property that specifies the initial size of the flex item before the flex grow and the flex shrink properties take effect. If you have flex grow property set to 0, then it will, then the flex basis kind of acts as a width property as well. And so this is kind of a really difficult concept to explain in such a short amount of time, but just know that it does, that's what it affects. One thing to watch out for is on internet browsers on iOS, any iPhone users, you cannot use the percentage units, otherwise you will get some unpredictable behavior. So I would just recommend sticking with your pixel unit on your flex basis. Then we have the flex shorthand. So in your CSS, you can set flex, and then it goes flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis. And so that just makes it a little bit easier and quicker to work with those properties, right? Then we have a line self. A line self is just like a line items on the Flex container, except it only applies to one item in that container, the item that you specify, right? So here, this is a line self on item 1, a line self flex end, flex center, and then flex or just stretch, right? And then again, it reacts the exact same way, but just applied to the one item that you have. So that brings me to when do you want to use Flexbox, or when would it be good to use Flexbox, right? Flexbox is really good for your component layout, right? Your individual component layouts. Here I've got a simple nav bar. Got the brand on the left, the menu items on the right. I've put the menu items in their own div, and then I've set justify content to space between. It just pushes them both items to the side, and then I've got a quick and easy nav bar there. And then we have just this component. Also, again, like I said, I work for a sign company, right? So we've got all these signs. So here I've got Flex containers within Flex containers within Flex containers, right? Kind of an inception of Flex containers. And as the page resizes, then you can adjust your media queries and change the order of the layout and how those are displayed. And so Flexbox is really good at these individual component layouts and design, but it's not really designed or really good for your entire page layout. And that's where Josh is going to talk a little bit about CSS Grid and how you can use that for your page layouts.
So yeah, let's take a minute to talk about Grid. So in the developer world, people like to pit technologies against each other: Angular versus React, Mac versus PC, and Flexbox versus Grid. One of the most important concepts to grasp when considering styling your layout is that these two technologies are not fighting for the same space. It really comes down to what the use case is. So like Brian talked about, Flexbox is good for component layout and styling of separate sections of the page. In Flexbox, you're working with a one-dimensional flow of content, either in a row or a column, whereas with Grid, you're able to put the content where it needs to be within a two-dimensional grid layout, as you can see on the right. So Flexbox, and this is kind of the important part. This next part is what really helped me understand the difference between Flexbox and Grid. Flexbox works from the content out, meaning that the properties on the item dictate how the item flexes within its container. So Grid works from the container in. You create your grid, you create your columns, your tracks, and your rows, and the content sits within that cell or that track. So here are a few Grid basics. Grid is a line-based system. So when you're placing your items on the grid, you use the line numbers or names. Grid gaps are similar to margins and can be applied to the entire grid or to, columns and rows independently. So grid tracks represent an item spanning across grid cells, and grid area simply refers to the two-dimensional placement of an item. When you're styling your grid layout, you can think you have to think about the properties for your containers and for your items. So here's some grid container properties. With the container properties controlling columns, rows, areas, and gaps. So let's build a grid, a really simple grid. First, you start with display grid. That's when all the magic happens. You create columns with each width defined, then rows the same way. And let's see. And then you add your grid gaps, and if you want to, you don't have to. and the grid gaps do not affect the outer edges. And yeah. So here's a short list of item properties. So we had our container properties. Now we've got the items that are going to go inside the grid. So when you place your item, you use grid lines to define the start and end points of where the item will be placed inside that grid. And then the grid area property is, it's kind of like you do all four, the first four at the same time, which I'm actually going to show you. I think that's one of the coolest parts of grid. So, let's see. Yeah. So what I'm going to show you is 3 types of syntax when placing items. First, the basic syntax. So keep in mind of how many lines it takes to place the item on the grid. So each property is listed out with its own value. You've got column start, column end, row start, row end. And this can kind of clutter your CSS. So if you see where it says grid column start on item C, is that C? Yeah. It's the cell all the way at the top right. It starts on line 5. And 5 is all the way at the bottom of the image. So that's where it starts. Grid column end is 6. So you have 5 columns, but you have 6 lines, which is kind of interesting. So using the / character, and this is the second method, you can indicate where an item's start and end will be, all on the same line. So for example, on item A, on the left, grid column start is set to grid line 1 and ends at grid line 2. The span property value in the grid rows for items A and B refers to how many grid lines the item will span over and where it will end. You can also use the grid area property to define the exact placement of the item with each line number separated by a / symbol. The line numbers start at the top and are defined in a counterclockwise order. So row start, then column start, row end, column end. So take a look at the blue box. Row start is on line 2. The top of the box. Column start is on line 3. Row end is on line 4. Is that right? No. Yeah, 4. And then column end is on line 5. So that's kind of how that works. Another way that you can position your items is by giving them a grid area name. I like to think of it as kind of a placeholder name that represents the item itself. So we have main, or I guess header, main, aside, and footer. And then now we can use the grid template areas property within the grid container. So as you can see, there's header, 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 main, 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 or I guess main, main, aside, and so forth. The string represents a row, and the words represent an item area. And basically, if you look at the very bottom, under grid template area, that produces what the image on the right. Kind of smooth, I think. So the power grid. This is where we're going to build. Is there any way to get this to remove that? All right, so I'll show you some, let me show you some markup. So I'm going to show you markup, the CSS for the items, and then the grid. So take a look at the markup here for a sec. On this part, let's see, lines 16 and 17. I wanted to make a point that it doesn't matter where you put the code in the markup. If you code it correctly in the CSS, the grid, it's going to place it where you need it to be. So if you see item, let's see, 2 and 3 are on the bottom, so they're out of place. That doesn't matter. And it's kind of cool because you can change the code and not have to change. Like if you want item 2 to be something different and somewhere different, you don't have to go into the markup and change it all around, which is kind of interesting. So here's the items. For each item, the use of grid area is, as previously mentioned, assigns a name to the area to be used elsewhere, right? I've also included a few other lines of code for other styling purposes. Now, we see how something so complicated could be written so easily with grid. And we have our container, and just to point out, the periods represent an empty cell or an empty space, and they're necessary, and they need to be spaced as well. So you can't do period, period, period. It's got to be period, space, 1, space, period, period, and so forth. All right, so responsive design. When you think of grid, you kind of, I guess at first I thought it kind of sounds restricting, right? But there's some cool stuff that's built into grid. So here are a few responsive properties. With CSS Grid layout, we get a new flexible unit, the FR unit. FR is a fractional unit, and one FR counts for 1 part of the available space. So a column or row that is labeled as auto is dictated by its content, which is different than the FR unit and similar to Flexbox. It's kind of like content driven. The max content and min content properties represent the sizing of the content distribution inside a given grid track. And then autofill is used here in the repeat notation. Let's see, yeah, right here. And basically it's used to repeat as many times as it has space to. And then min-max is, so we can specify the minimum pixels, and then on the grid track, what was that? Oh, sorry. And then the other side is based on the content. So those are a few responsive, and you want to bake those in before you have to write your media queries out and save yourself some work. Here's a cool thing. When you've got an app and you want like this item A, maybe it's a title or something like that, or a nav bar. If you want it to always be kind of spanning on the top, then you use, as it says, grid column 1 and -1. So it's always going to be 1 on the left, and the right edge, most right edge line on a grid container is always going to be -1. So I thought that was kind of interesting that you can kind of control that really easily. So media queries, there's a couple things to think about when you're doing media queries with CSS Grid. Either you can change how many columns in a row, or you can change where the items are placed on the columns. So I chose the latter. I chose to change where the items are going to be placed. So here's an example. We have several items called new item, so they're basically the same. So we've got new item. We'll use the same properties as we did for item A. So let's imagine that prior to this slide, I guess, new item spanned the whole viewport. Okay, when the viewport reaches 53.125 ems, with the number of columns being 12 originally, you can set the column start, and as it says column start 1 on the left still, but you set it at 7 so that column in at 7 so that it's now at the kind of the middle of the page. If yeah, so that's kind of interesting. At 75M, it spans a third of the screen. Let me show you the code here. And that's one way to use media queries in CSS Grid. So you don't have to change your grid. You just change where your items sit on the grid. And as it says here under new item, the start is at line 1, and now it's at line 4 instead of 7. Can I use Grid? The answer is yes, you can. CSS Grid is now stable across all modern browsers, so unless you have to support users on old browsers, you can feel safe using Grid on your projects. But what if you do have to support old browsers? Which we do, right? This feature query is actually not only for CSS Grid. It's a standard, just as it says there, CSS feature query. So, but what happens is if there's no grid, then it just goes to a display flex, and you can write your media queries out too, where it kind of does a fallback. So one thing that Grid also does is fallbacks, and what that means is it overrides. Oh, I see. So Grid fallbacks and overrides, so that's what they're called, are the ways in which Grid interacts with other layout methods. These definitions mean that as soon as an item becomes a Grid item, other behavior that you may have used for older browsers are overwritten.
So we wanted to end with how we can use Flexbox and Grid together and how you can really unlock the power of both of them, right? So here we've got a grid laid out in the orange items, and then all of the so the orange items are grid items and flex parents at the same time. And then all the red elements are the flex children, right? You can also set it up where the orange items here are the flex items and grid parents, and then the red elements are the grid items, right? So you can use them both hand in hand. Like Josh said, they're not mutually exclusive technologies. We should be starting to utilize both in our projects. And so a couple of resources that we wanted to point out. Rachel Andrew, she's like the queen of Grid. She's got some really, really solid content on this topic, and I really recommend you guys looking her up. CSS Grid Garden is a tool you can use to get down the basics of how to use CSS Grid, and it's really helpful. Mozilla Firefox has a tool, so right there in your CSS, right there, I don't know if you guys can see it, there's a little waffle icon next to the display grid. If you click on that, then it will pull up a kind of like a grid overlay on your site to kind of help you visualize where things are being set. A couple of links. You have Understanding Flexbox by Ohans Emanuel. It's a Medium article from FreeCodeCamp, and it goes in depth. It is incredibly in depth and on Flexbox, and is a really, really great resource. CSS Tricks has some good stuff, talking about Grid and Flexbox. And then Flexiboxes is kind of like Grid Garden, and you can kind of mess around and play with your stuff on there. Again, Rachel Andrews on the links, some other links there for CSS Grid. Do you guys have any questions?
So what happens if you assign multiple elements to the same grid set? Put both of them in there?
That is a good question.
So what do you mean multiple?
So if you assign both like to the top left corner, if you assign 2 items to the top left corner.
So it's really kind of interesting because in Grid, because you're assigning, let's say, 2 items to one area, it overlaps. For example, I am colorblind, right, by birth, and I have put like 2 different shapes over, a square. Let's say it's 4 cells, and then you've got another shape that's sharing one cell. It will like change color. So if there's a blue box and a yellow box, that one they share is going to be green. And that's really cool. So you can kind of be creative on that.
So with that, I would assume that it would also take like the priority of the markup, like whatever came last, like a z-index type deal. So.
And you can use z-index with the...
Any other questions?
What happens if you go outside of the grid box? So if you have 6 columns, 6 lines available, and you said your last one be 10.
That's good. That's good. So with grid, there's called implicit and explicit. I don't know what the last part is, but basically like rows or columns. And it assigns this item that's kind of out there, it assigns it a place. So it gives it a place. And
so it basically extends the grid out to include that item, and then you'll have extra rows in that grid now.
Yeah. So.
Maybe you could look at grid items and find your
Yeah, to an extent, that's not really good practice, but yeah, to an extent you can do that. Cool. Any other questions? Cool, thanks guys. Sorry for all the technical issues.